Tim Baker, welcome back to the show.
Good to be back. What's going on, Tim?
I'm looking forward to the discussion today. We're going to talk about a question that really comes up often in pharmacists that both you and I have a chance to converse with, which is, what do I do with an old employer retirement account? It could be the first job transition or the fifth job transition, but often we'll have these 401ks or these 403bs and wondering like what should I do with them? Should I leave them? Should I move them? And today we're going to talk about the different options, some of the pros and cons of what you might do with those accounts. Before we get too far into it, we have a brand new guide that we've released titled "The Best and Worst Moves to Make with an Old 401k." You can download that guide, which is a supplement to today's episode. Go to yourfinancialpharmacist.com/moves. Again, yourfinancialpharmacist.com/moves. And a shout out to Jeff Keimer, a pharmacist that has collaborated with us on several writings. He wrote the book Fire RX, The Pharmacist Guide to Financial Independence. He helped us put together the content for this guide as well. Just an overall community pharmacist, money nerd. So shout out to Jeff for his help in putting together this guide. Tim, this topic probably, I would suspect, is you're conversing with pharmacists that are wanting to learn more about our fee-only financial planning services. I've got to believe that this is one that comes up fairly often. Is that correct?
It does. One of the things that, when I talk to a prospective client that is in transition, it's like, I'm unsure what the best path is for, my old 401k or, some people, make the habit of collecting 401ks or 403bs and they're just kind of scattered and a bit disjointed. So, what's the best, path for me and what should I do with those plans? So yeah, it's important because if you think about it, Tim, like, 401k, 403b, often outside of your house and then eventually will eclipse the value of your house in terms of like the biggest asset on your balance sheet. So this is a big decision really over the course of your career in terms of like what to do with, your 401k, especially when you leave an employer. And I think it's important to analyze and examine and just try to figure out what's the best thing for you to do.
Yeah, and especially, I think about the job transitions that may happen. It's rare to see someone now that's worked with the same employer, for 20, 25
That's
years,
right.
right? So if you're changing jobs every 3, 4, 5 years, which can be pretty normal, you're going to start to accrue several of these accounts, and what are the options that we have to do with them along the way. And we're going to talk about 401k, 403b interchangeably. They are similar yet different. We've covered that on previous episodes. Both of them are employer-sponsored retirement plans. Typically, we think 401k, those that work for a for-profit, 403b, those that work for a nonprofit, or thinking about something like a TSP for those that work for the federal government. So we're going to use those terms interchangeably, but they are not the same thing. There are important differences between them, but for the sake of the conversation of job transitions and what do I do with these accounts, we're going to lump both of them together. Tim, before we get into the options, let's cast a vision for why this is important, right? When I think about my own experiences, first job or two, specifically thinking back to a memory of Jess's old 403b that was kind of hanging out there. And, after a while, we didn't really remember kind of what was there, and we were moving on to the next account. We left it at the time being. We would eventually do a transfer and a rollover that we'll talk about in this episode. But when I think about the potential consequences here, things come to mind like, hey, it's out of sight, out of mind, which means we might not just be paying attention to it like we are other accounts, and therefore it might not be optimized in the same way that we're treating our other investment accounts. What else comes to mind for you about why this is important? Before we talk about functionally what we do with them, why is it important that we evaluate what we might do with these old accounts?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the first things that we do with clients when we kind of go down the path of like our financial roadmap is we call it a get organized meeting, where we're essentially taking inventory of everything that we have. So, it's cash, it's credit card debt, it's student loans, it's investment accounts, it's real estate, those types of things, right? So often what can sometimes be a black box in this, especially if you've collected 401ks, is like, what are these plans and how are they actually invested and what am I actually paying in fees? So visibility is really the first step to build a cohesive, comprehensive plan. And like I mentioned, as your career continues, a 401k, or if you roll it into an IRA, will be one of the largest things on your balance sheet over time. So it's really important to have a intentional plan with how you're going to manage these assets and how do they fit in the overall picture of your ability to build wealth and then to spend that wealth like in retirement. So, for a lot of people, they'll say like, I don't even know where these statements are, or I have a statement, I have no idea like how it's invested or what it's, it could be at one extreme of like, I just don't know what this is, to like, the other extreme of like, I know it's probably not optimized and I need some help with this. So I think it's really important to, again, have a plan for this asset and make sure that it is aligned with what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, when I think about the maintenance that we typically will do with our clients on their various investment accounts, right? We're looking at things like, what's the asset allocation according to our goals, according to our risk tolerance and capacity. And, as the market does its thing over time and things may get out of whack, how do we rebalance those accounts? How do we make sure that
Correct.
this is fee efficient, right? So if that's out of sight, out of mind, that's a potential risk that we're losing eyes on the intentionality of those funds. And one other thing I want to say here while we're talking about this is that it's not uncommon, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not uncommon for some financial planning firms to look at your current employer 401k or 403b and say like, hey, we see that, but we're not necessarily going to spend time helping you manage that, which can be another thing to think about.
Yeah, I think a quarter of advisors, if you're working with a quarter of advisors, don't help you with a current 401k, which I think is bonkers. Um, so to me, like if you're looking at a comprehensive plan, like I think that's important to make sure. Like if I'm, like when we do, you don't mention asset allocation. When we establish an asset allocation, whether it's 90-10, 90% equities, 10% bonds, or 70-30 or 80, whatever it is, like to me, that conversation isn't complete until you give a 70-30 or a 90-10 or whatever it is for that held away or for that current 401k. I just think that I don't know, lazy is not the word, but the reason that advisors don't do that is because they don't get paid on those. They can't get paid on that. So part of this discussion is following the money. Like, how how do fees work, and, what's the scope for the fee that I'm paying? And to me, if advisors is unwilling to help me with a 401k that they're not getting paid directly on, that to me is a red flag. Um, if you have my best interest in mind, and this is a big part of my balance sheet, then help a brother, help a sister out is my viewpoint. But you mentioned like asset allocation is big. It's a big part of this, but I think part of this discussion of like the options and what to do is also asset location and how an asset location is often forgotten, but I think it's one of the things that is just as important as asset allocation, meaning, are these accounts taxable, pre-tax, Roth, that type of thing. And to me, you are confined inside of a 401k to be able to pull some levers to make sure that the percentages of where your assets are held are controllable, or you can affect change there. And in some accounts you can, and in others you can't. So it's important to understand that. So, and again, one of the things you mentioned is like rebalance, and just to address that really quick, if you're actively contributing to a 401k, the action of rebalancing kind of happens naturally every time you get paid and put money in. If you leave that job and that money's just sitting there, the market does what it does. So that asset allocation that you set will drift because you're not actively putting money into it. So you could drift into something that's much, much more conservative or more likely much more aggressive than what you signed up for. So that's another thing to be aware of, is that, one of the important things about this is that, when you're not actively putting dollars in, you tend to drift more out of, what you signed up for, which can be problematic, especially when the market turns sour.
Yeah, great points. And I'm glad you mentioned the asset location, because that's a really important one. That if we're on autopilot with some of these things, or we just leave them and forget them, we're not necessarily thinking about those asset location questions, which will raise some important decisions like, might we or might we not do Roth conversions, for example. So
Right. Right.
really good stuff. Let's talk about the various options. Option one, perhaps the option that has the least amount of friction, is do nothing and leave money in the old plan. So I leave my employer, I go to work for a new employer, and I just leave the funds in the provider that was managing the 401k for the employer that I just left. Tim, where might this option not make the most sense?
Yeah, if you're lazy or you don't want to deal with pulling statements and everything that it takes to move an account, this might be right for you, right? You just basically don't do
Mm-hmm.
anything. You still enjoy the continued tax deferred growth, whether it's a traditional bucket or a Roth bucket. You still get that benefit, which is great. You still get potential benefits of a lot of 401ks will have the options for like institutional share classes, which can be lower
Mm-hmm.
in fees compared to like just a retail, what you would buy on the street. Um, and one of the things what's great about, keeping it at the 401k or even transferring it to a new 401k is that 401ks have a little bit more protection by ERISA, which is the Employment Retirement Income Security Act. So under this federal law, creditors can't touch your 401k in most cases, even in cases of like
Mm-hmm.
bankruptcy, lawsuits, or collections. The IRS can still get to your money. If you're in a divorce, a quadro, a qualified domestic relations order can still access those accounts, or any type of criminal restitution. IRAs still have protection, but it could be limited compared. And I can kind of get into that a little bit more when we talk about IRAs. But that's the big benefit. I think the cons here, just like if you leave it or if you move it, you're still limited to the investment
Yeah.
choices by that 401k,
Mm-hmm.
Tim. So I always talk about like, with a 401k, you're in a sandbox and you only have so many toys that you can play
Mm-hmm.
with. And those toys are typically mutual funds. On average, 401ks have about 20 to 25 investment options, which is typically good enough to build a diverse portfolio. But in looking at many 401ks, I think you can throw out 80% of them because they're crap. And what I mean crap is like they're typically high
Expense
fees.
ratios. Yep.
Exactly. So you're often stuck with just, maybe 4, 5, or 6 funds
Mm-hmm.
that are good. Most 401ks will have exposure to US stocks from large, mid, small, not all the time. Most will have exposure to internationals. They'll have bond funds. They'll typically have a stable like money market fund. But they'll miss things like real estate if you believe in real estate, emerging market. A lot of 401ks don't have a digital exposure if you believe in commodities. So I think that's one of the cons. I think also the big con I think is like the possibility of higher fees related to the
Yeah.
401k. So we mentioned investment fees. So this is the expense ratio that the funds themselves take to build out kind of
Mm-hmm.
a balanced ETF or mutual fund in this case. So on average, the investment fees inside of a 401k are about 39 basis points or 0.39%.
Mm-hmm.
So if I have a $100,000 portfolio every year, $390 of that is basically being absorbed by the funds that I'm in. And the other big thing that I think is a detriment to a 401k is administrative fees.
Yep.
So this covers the cost of running the plan, record keeping, compliance tests, and maybe legal fees. So there's really no getting away because these plans are very much tested and looked at by the federal government, there's a lot of record keeping that goes, and that typically is passed on to the participants, to the investor. So the average administrative fees for a smaller plan can range anywhere from 0.5% to 1%. So if it's 1% and I'm paying 0.39% on investment fees, that's 1.39 or almost $1,400 of $100,000. As the plans get bigger, like a mid-sized plan, so this is a plan that has assets of 10 to 100 million, you're looking at 25 to 50 basis points, so 0.25% to 0.5%. And then larger plans, you're looking at, 0.10, that type of thing. But then you add the investment, the expense ratio. There could also be flat fees associated with administrative fees, that type of thing. So, it's important to understand this, and this data is hard to find, Tim. It's not going to be on a statement. It's not transparent. We talked about how poor financial services can be in terms of transparency. So you could be paying anywhere from 20 basis points to 0.2% to 1.5% and not know it, right? So it's important that, and it's kind of like the rule that if your employer is bigger, typically the plan is better, not always. If your employer is smaller, typically the worse it is for a participant. So fees are going to be a big thing. And what we talked about too is like the last couple things this year, like if you're inside of a 401k, you can't really do Roth conversions, which I think from an asset location perspective, it really limits your ability to kind of optimize the tax portion of your plan. And I think just if you're keeping it there and you're collecting 401ks, I think it's harder to manage a cohesive plan that is pointed in the direction that you need to point it in and optimize for what you're trying to do. So there are pros, there's obviously cons, and a lot of the pros and cons will kind of, are kind of the same with the second option, which is kind of rolling it into your new 401k. They're very similar.
Yeah, and I think as you're describing some of the limitations of a 401k, we've seen in the clients that we've talked with and worked with, everything from, hey, I work for, let's say, an independent pharmacy that doesn't even offer a 401k, or if they do, it might have very limited options, higher fee options, right? Very small employer, all the way up to I work for a giant company where we've got, maybe more options, maybe not more options because of the sandbox that you were talking about, but I might have, lower fees on the administrative side as well as the investment option. So 401ks are not all created equal, which really plays into this decision. What might I do with this 401k, this old 401k, in terms of either leave it or move it or put it in an IRA? And we'll talk about here in a moment, when you go from some of the variants we're talking about with various 401ks and you look at something like an IRA rollover, at that moment, we're starting to level the playing field, right? Because once we're into the open market, those limitations aren't necessarily the same that they were by any means. We've got more options to be able to choose from, which might for some, to be fair, this can be overwhelming. And I think this is where
it's a con. Yeah.
It's a con. Paralysis
by analysis.
And I think about some of the employers that I had early in my career. I remember it was about 15, 20 options, as you mentioned. And the visual that was coming to mind as you were talking is, if we're bowling and we got bumper lanes on, right? In terms of like, I can only, move so far. Thankfully, I can't put the ball in the gutter. So if I'm overwhelmed by, asset allocation decisions or choosing investments or not understanding where those investments might want to go, there's a limited menu of choice, which can be valuable, but also as we start to really build the financial plan in a way that it's custom to you and your goals and individualized to what we're trying to achieve long term, some of those options that we have might be more valuable, as well as you articulated, really trying to keep those fees down, because as we've covered in this podcast many times before, the erosion of the portfolio that can happen due to those fees can be very real over the long term. Tim, one other idea that just came to mind that I want to get your thoughts on, and probably I'm bringing my own personal experience bias here, because I made this mistake on Jess and I made this mistake on her 403b very early in our investing career. Is it was a very small account, wasn't there for a long period of time. We chose the option one, do nothing. At that time, admittedly, didn't really have a good idea of what were the options available. And it became a nuisance after a while. I remember getting these statements in the mail periodically, and it was like, just something we weren't often thinking about, right? Because it was from a year ago, 2 years ago, whatever the timeline was. And because the account was so small, I felt like the combination of out of sight, out of mind and the smaller account balance drew us into the temptation of perhaps the absolute worst move to make, which is cash out that account. So I think, if you think of an account that's relatively small and is kind of an annoyance factor, out of sight, out of mind, that tendency, that risk arguably could increase versus if we're able to combine that with other funds and we've set an intentional plan and strategy for those funds. I think it might minimize the likelihood of making a decision like that.
Yeah, and I don't know if this is one upping you, Tim, but I think that I did the same thing, but it was more of avoidance.
Mm,
And they said, hey, they were sending me letters that said like, if you don't do something with this, we're gonna send you a check. Like, so they cashed it out for me, which is obviously something that you don't want to do. Any dollars that you have behind the wall of a Roth or a traditional is
mhm.
valuable. And if you extrapolate those dollars out over the course of a career, even if you don't do anything with it, and if we're invested somewhat appropriately, those dollars are going to grow and
Mhm.
and be potentially substantial by the end of a 30, 40, 50-year career. So yeah, I mean, some plans have, have things built into the plan documents that say if you're not a
Right.
participant, you're a non-participant, meaning you've moved on, and the account is this small, then
Mhm.
they're not gonna keep you on their books, and they're gonna basically force a rollover, which then if you don't know what you're doing, you go to cash and you're paying the 10%
Mhm.
penalty plus the taxes. So it might not seem that big of a deal, but I think in the grand scheme of things, it can be. So yes, absolutely. And again, I'm biased here, but I'm like, that's hire an
Mhm.
advisor. Just help you
Mhm.
deal with it.
Mhm.
Just if you can get the statements, then advisor can do the rest. Um, so I think it's really important to, if you're it's frequent that I talk to pharmacists and they're like, yeah, I have three old retirement accounts. My spouse has
Right.
two old retirement accounts. We're finally at a point where we just need to figure out, because like I'll ask like, well, like what's your, if we add up these accounts, like there might be $500,000, 750,000, maybe
Mhm.
even more. And I'm like, well, what's your investment philosophy? Like, how are you managing it? And it's like, I don't know.
Mhm.
And again, like I think that, and we've talked about this before, a pharmacist with the kind of money that pharmacists make and what they will amass over their course of their career, the sooner they answer that question or work with an advisor to help them answer the question, the more efficient and optimized they will
Yeah.
be. The longer that you're like, I don't know, where it's in target date funds. And again, I'm not hating on target date funds, but target date funds typically don't are more expensive, and their glide paths of how they transition from equity to fixed income over the course of the life of the fund is typically not in line with what you
Yeah.
want, right?
Yep.
It's just not.
Yep.
So to me, the sooner that you are on the path, you're following a roadmap from a financial perspective, the more efficient. And it's kind of the whole adage of like work smarter, not
Mhm.
harder, right? And I think sometimes the disjointed investment philosophy across multiple accounts lends itself to just being, again, inefficient and wasting time and money that you don't otherwise have to.
I think there's also decision fatigue there. When I think about the
Totally,
example
totally
the
is.
example you gave, which is not an uncommon one. You and I were talking about this a couple weeks ago, and I wrote a blog post on this called The Accidental Millionaire, which is like, hey, I wake up in my 40s and we've been saving 10, 15, 20% of our account, of our income towards various investment accounts. And we wake up and we're like, oh, wow, we've got north of $1 million, a fairly common situation. And naturally, there's this point, not of reckoning, but of like, well, now what? We haven't really necessarily been super intentional on where we're going, why we're going there, what's the asset allocation, what's the asset location, are we on track, are we not on track? I mean, but those unanswered questions can be exhausting, and they're all answerable questions, right? And I think that's to the point
Yeah.
you're making of like, let's figure them out.
Yeah, I mean, in the beginning, you're just like, it's just the start,
Yep.
right? And just get it rolling. And then it's kind of, you're kind of shooting first, ask questions later. But eventually you need to ask those questions of like, am I truly
Hmm.
optimized? And again, like, we're not talking chump change. The wealth that you should amass over the course of your career, that should sustain you till the end of your life is substantial,
Yes.
or it should be
Hmm.
substantial. So, um, having a plan and a strategy, asset location, asset allocation. Again, if all those things sound like foreign to you, that's okay.
Hmm.
Like, but I would say hire an advisor. Like, you need it.
So option two is we can roll it over to our new employer. So let's say I worked at a hospital, I had a 403B, I left that hospital, I'm now working for another hospital. I do have an option to roll over my old 403B or old 401k to my new employer account. Now, this might, Tim, bring an advantage of consolidation. It could bring an advantage that
Yep.
we have everything in one place. We can see it. We can be intentional. It's not that out of sight, out of mind risk that we were just talking about, but it still carries all the same limitations we were just talking about of the limited options and fees within the retirement plan sandbox. Correct?
Yeah, you consolidate. So instead of collecting, two or three or four 401ks, you still have the one. If you leave that job, you can do it again
Mm-hmm.
and you still have the one. There are things that 401ks offer, like loan provisions and things like that, that IRAs do not, that I guess can be a pro. You still have the creditor protection, under the new 401k. It can allow for easier backdoor Roth IRA contributions, since it keeps, pre-tax funds out of a traditional IRA. So
Mm-hmm.
that would be a big plus as well. But yeah, to your point, the cons are you're still limited by the investment menu. You're still limited by the fees, which I think are substantial compared to, an IRA. You can't do those conversions, which I think are going to be more important down the road. And I think, again, the sooner that you can kind of figure out
Mm-hmm.
how much you should have in each bucket, the easier it is to do. If you're overly weighted in pre-tax or overly weighted in taxable or Roth, then that's a problem, or can be a problem. And then there's some plans, Tim, that don't accept rollovers. They just don't do it, which I think is becoming more and more rare, but they do. Those do exist. So you might be forced to do, to either leave it or roll it to an IRA. So yeah, a lot of the same things, pros and cons, that, your old 401k will follow you to the new
Mm-hmm.
401k.
Mm-hmm. Option three, Tim, then is that we could roll it over to an IRA. So we're going to move a old 401k or an old 403b or multiple old 401ks, 403bs into an IRA. And I know this is a very common approach. It's what I did in my own 401a when I left Ohio State, and ultimately put that into an IRA. And the idea is that you could, if you have multiple old accounts, eventually you can consolidate those all into one. So tell us about this option. Why often, but not always? Why often it may be the preferred option, and what are some of the pros and cons here?
Yeah, so the big thing is like you have wider investment options, right? So that can be a pro and a con. So you're out of the sandbox. You're not limited to what the 401k offers, and there's thousands of stocks, bonds, mutual funds, ETFs that cover all asset classes. So typically, because of, some of the risk associated with investments, 401ks don't want to do certain asset classes. So they say, hey, we're just going to offer these. They're kind of down the middle, and that's it. So outside of the 401k and in IRAs, you can really tailor the portfolio to what you want as an
Mm-hmm.
investor. So that could be looking at all the asset classes that we mentioned and have a diversified portfolio that way. It could be where you are a Vanguard, you're a bogglehead, and you want all Vanguard. Sometimes you can't do that inside of a 401k because they only offer Schwab or
Mm-hmm.
Fidelity or things like that. Um, Most 401ks don't offer like a digital asset exposure if you believe in that. Um, a lot of 401ks won't allow you to, invest directly into stocks outside of the stock that they, their own, the employer stock. So some people like things like, individual stocks, or like right now, my brokerage account is invested like direct indexing. So this
Mm-hmm.
enables you to buy stocks that make up a particular index, like the S&P 500, that has tax benefits. So you can book tax losses on positions that have decreased in value. So these losses can be harvested even when the market is up overall. So this is another strategy that one can use that is not available inside of a 401k. And then if you lean more towards value or growth or emerging market, some of those things might not be available in a 401k. So you can kind of get a little bit more nuanced with what you're trying to achieve. The big thing here is that the fees are often not the same. So like we mentioned, you could be paying north of 1%, 1.5% in a 401k, which that doesn't necessarily exist in an IRA. Now there's a caveat, and I'll get to that in a second. It simplifies the planning. If you consolidate accounts, which is true if you consolidate a 401k to a 401k. The big thing, again, asset location, is that you can convert a rollover IRA, which is synonymous with the traditional IRA, to a Roth IRA, and do that. Like, this has nothing to do with a backdoor conversion.
Yep.
This is, I have $100,000 in a traditional. I'm not making any money this year. I'm going to put $40,000 from my traditional to my Roth, pay the taxes when I'm not making any money. And basically now I have $40,000 in a Roth and $60,000 in a traditional. There's a lot of power in that, and the ability to do that in an IRA that you can't do in a 401k. So those levers that we're pulling as we're in the accumulation phase to then go into the withdrawal phase, that's work that can be done in the accumulation phase that you can't do in a 401k. The big thing here, and I think from a advisor perspective, is follow the money. So why is my advisor telling me that 100% of my time I should roll it over? Typically it's because that's how advisors get paid. So most advisors will say, hey, I can't help you unless you have $500,000, or I can't help you unless I have $1 million. You have $1 million. What does that actually mean? That means that advisor only works with clients that have investable assets of $500,000 or $1 million. Investable assets are typically old 401ks, old 403bs, IRA accounts, Roth IRAs, brokerage accounts. Yep. Any other accounts are typically not accounts that advisor can manage on. So there's a conflict of interest there in their advice to their client or to a prospective client. And that should be known. And again, I think what we have said often and consistently is that in financial services, we are terrible at being transparent with the scope of work that's being provided and the fee that's being charged. It's often nebulous in terms of the scope of work. Yeah, we do planning. Well, what does that mean? Are you going to help me with my 401k that I contribute in? A lot of times, no. Are you going to help me with my student loans? Are you going to help me with insurance or whatever that is? And a lot of the case, like, it is not explained and the client is left confused. And then how am I being charged? And we went through that whole episode, Tim. Is it buried in a insurance product? Is it transparent? Can I actually see the fee or not? So what we have found is that, again, transparency and explaining the conflict of interest are important. So if you have an old 401k and you can roll it over, a lot of the times, for the reason that we talk about, it's important or it's good for you to do that. However, at YFP, we're going to bill part of your fee from that asset. Yep. And what we have found is it's more of a sustainable relationship with clients if we're billing them from the assets that we're managing versus cash flow. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is if we're charging 1% on a $500,000 old 401k that we're managing, that is easier for a client to pay than to bill and pay out a cash flow or to pay out a credit card. That money is still your money. Money is fungible. It's still important to understand that you're paying that. But from a longevity perspective, it's easier to pay from an asset. So a lot of advisors say, I can't help you unless you have those amount of assets. So I think it's just really important to be upfront. I think what a lot of people do is they're like, oh, well, I'm paying 1% or I'm paying half a percent of my 401k, like it doesn't make sense for me to roll it over. The apples to oranges is that if you're working with an advisor, if they're doing it correctly, you get access to a comprehensive plan that is going to not only advise on the assets that they're managing, but the held away assets and every other part of the financial plan, right? So the assets are often the engine for which to pay an advisor. It's just important to know that up front, which a lot of people don't.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about there is transparency, right, in that model, and making sure that
Correct.
we understand it, as you mentioned, where a fee comes from. Money is money. And as long as we know where it's coming from, we feel comfortable, we understand that's really important. And I'll add to your discussion, why is longevity of the relationship important, right? What we know, myself included, yourself included, is that the market cycles are going to have significant ups and downs, and we are in this for the long run. Not just the long run to like retirement, like the long run of our funds being able to continue to grow and produce a retirement paycheck so that inflation doesn't erode our purchasing power. That means that we need to sustain the progress and the momentum, not only on our investments, but as you highlighted, in every other part of the financial plan. And if the market's going to do what it has done historically, and every 5 years, we're going to have a fairly significant drop of, say, 20% or more, human behavior and emotion suggests that most of us, if we do this completely ourselves, at one point, if not more than one point, are going to make a mistake, whether it be buying high or selling low, and not keeping that long-term horizon in mind. And a huge piece of the value equation, again, we're only talking about investments, key part of the financial plan, but of course there's a lot more than just the investment part of the plan, is to have a person in our corner that is helping us keep the long-term perspective and horizon in mind. Because we know that it's those decisions, if we make them irrationally, which a lot of us, I've done it before. I was telling you, before we hit record, like I'm guilty of back in the day, buying Circuit City penny stock. I was convinced Circuit City was coming back, like laughable, right? Yep. At this moment. I've cashed out an old 403B account. Like these things, when we look at the volatility, and this season we're in right now is just a great reminder. If you would have been napping the last 3 months, it's like nothing has happened in the market, right? But if you're checking your accounts every single day, especially thinking about those people that are nearing retirement or transitioning out, like palpitations might be happening. Anxiety. We need someone alongside of us to say, hey, we've got this. We've planned for this. We accounted for this. Let the markets do its thing, and we're going to be able to weather this and look at the long-term perspective.
Yeah, and we were talking about like asset location. Like a robo advisor is not going to do that.
Totally.
A lot of advisors aren't looking at that. I've had so many conversations in the last couple of weeks, Tim, where it's like I've been working with an advisor. They are like the one I had recently. It's like I have a Roth IRA with them. I have a brokerage account with them, and I'm like, why are you funding a brokerage account? And he's like, I don't know. He just recommended. I'm like, are you maxing out your 401k? And he's like, no. So they're setting up these accounts that they can get paid on. They
or buying
are
a whole life policy. Or
they're sold crappy insurance that they don't need. No help on the student loans. No help on this goal or that goal. I'm like, did you guys sit down and talk about goals? No. So, and again, like I don't want to sit here and like talk negative about, but like that's just not serving your interest. Like it's not serving your interest. And to me, I think what we're talking about is again, looking at this from A to Z, and yep. It's not like, well, we're not getting paid on that directly, so I can't help you with that. I think that's asinine.
Yeah.
So it's really aligning yourself with a planner, I think, that has your best interest in mind. And it's hard to talk about this without kind of sounding like, hey, these people are bad. I don't think they're bad. I think it's the environment that they are in is not conducive to put in the interest of their clients first. You could listen to that and be like, and be scared away and be like, well, I don't want to work with advisors. But I also would say that the majority of the people listening to this podcast, I think, need an advisor based on the level of wealth that we're talking about. Pharmacists are in the top 10 to 15% of income earners in the United States. Those are typically individuals that need professional help that, it becomes more complicated as your estate grows, the taxes, all, the complexity, all that. And again, I think the sooner that you get in front of that, the more efficient you're going to be. So, but I think us speaking about this directly, because I'm just like, I kind of get it exasperated. I'm like, why? Like, why? Because like, I'm sure there's examples in the medical world where you're like, why is this prescribed? Or like, what is going on here? And it's like, you probably follow the money with the doctor's office, right? No offense to doctors, but I'm sure there's, I've talked about this. Like when I first got into financial services, we'd have mutual fund wholesalers come to our office in a fancy car, wearing a fancy suit, take us out to a fancy lunch, show us fancy glossaries of their fancy funds, and said, "Hey, Tim, when client XYZ rolls over their $500,000 portfolio, wink, like use our funds." And I'm just like, ugh, like your funds are 20 times more expensive than, what you can get out there. Are they 20 times better from a performance perspective? Are they 20 times safer for the same amount of performance? And often the time is the answer to that is no. So, it is kind of following the money. And I think most of the time when you ask advisors, they kind of squirm in their seat about how they arrive at fees or how they get paid or things like that. And I think that's a huge red flag.
Yeah, and I think this is really where the fiduciary obligation matters. We throw that term around a lot, but if you're having a conversation with someone about what should I do with an old account, right? We've kind of made the case that in many instances it may make sense to roll it over an IRA, but there may be a case where that doesn't for whatever reason. And so to have that perspective where yes, this may be where the fees derive, but if that were to be the case or the situation, right, the fiduciary obligation says I'm acting in the best interest of the client as they're making these decisions. So as we wrap up this third option of rolling it over to an IRA, some of the key benefits I heard you say were consolidation, right? We have multiple accounts that we can have eyes in one account. We have more investment options. We're out of the sandbox. We typically can have lower fees as we look at more options. And then asset location. We've made a case about why asset location is so important. And inside of an employer account, we don't have that same flexibility if we were to want to do things like a Roth conversion, for example.
Yeah. And if we think about this with the end in mind, like I think if I'm building out, like if I'm looking at a client and I'm trying to build out a retirement paycheck, I think the perfect makeup of that client in terms of the ability to have a concentrated, focused strategy that I can then spend is that they have a brokerage account, they have a pre-tax, rollover or traditional IRA, and they have a Roth. And then we're figuring out Social Security and maybe they're making consultant income and things like that. But that's essentially it. Like the 401k that they had, we've rolled over. They might get some pension dollars. That's great. That's gravy. But those are the three accounts in which we're basically pulling the levers to then say, hey, you need $55,000 out of these three accounts. We're going to get X per year or, per month from Social Security, maybe X from a pension, maybe some. But that to me is the end in mind. You're not looking at 401k, old 401k, IRAs. It's those three accounts that you're essentially is your dashboard. I will say, Tim, I just want to mention the cons on this. So we mentioned of going to an IRA. It's the paralysis by analysis, right? If you're an overthinker, I don't want these, accounts to be stuck in cash because you don't know what to do. IRAs typically don't offer loan provisions, which can be both a pro and a con. The creditor protection might be weaker. So in bankruptcy, IRAs are protected up to 1.512 million under federal bankruptcy law. So, and then different states have different things. So that might be something to consider. And then moving funds here could complicate like a backdoor Roth strategy potentially. So those are the cons. But to me, this is all about transparency, understand the conflict of interest, and knowing, again, like if you're going to work with someone, what's the scope of work, how does the fee get charged, and then being able to make a decision that you think is best for you.
So we've covered three options, right? Option one was do nothing. Option two is roll it over to a new employer account. Option three is roll it to IRA. To be complete, there's technically a fourth option, which would be that you could cash it out. I think we've made the case for why that's typically, if not always, not what we want to do, right? So if it's something we cash out, if it ever hits your bank account and it's not a direct rollover, to either a new employer account or to an IRA, we've got a tax problem on a traditional account. So that's going to be subject to federal income tax, state income tax, and often because of when those funds hit, and it may be a while till you file your taxes, that might mean we have a surprise coming at tax filing time if we weren't thinking about what the impact of that was going to be. So that account's going to take a major haircut. And so if at all possible, especially if we have a lot of time for that money to grow, compound, for time value money to work its magic, we want to let those funds continue to do that, whether it mean a rollover or one of the other options we've already discussed. All right, as we wrap up here, we've covered several options of what you can do with an old 401k, 403b. As a reminder, we've got a brand new guide that will help give you some more information on this topic. You can download that guide, Best and Worst Moves to Make with an Old 401k, by going to yourfinancialpharmacist.com/moves. Again, that's yourfinancialpharmacist.com/moves. And if you're listening to this, say, hey, I'd love to have a conversation to learn more about YFP's one-on-one fee-only financial planning services. We'd love to do that. We work with pharmacists virtually all across the country. You can book a discovery call by going to yourfinancialpharmacist.com. You'll see an option to book a discovery call. Tim Baker leads those calls, typically 45 to 60 minutes in length. It's an opportunity for us to learn more about your financial situation, your goals, what's going on, not only with something like an old account, but what's going on with the rest of the financial plan. What are the goals? What's our progress? How are we tracking? We can share more about our services and ultimately see whether or not there's a good fit for there. So again, yourfinancialpharmacist.com, and you can click on the option to book a discovery call. Tim Baker, great stuff as always. Thanks so much, and wishing everyone a great week ahead. Take care. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of the YFP Podcast. And if you like what you heard, please do us a favor and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to the show, which will help other pharmacists find the podcast. Before we conclude, I want to again thank this week's sponsor of the Your Financial Pharmacist podcast, First Horizon. First Horizon offers a professional home loan option, aka a doctor or pharmacist loan, that requires a 3% down payment for a single-family home or townhome for first-time homebuyers, 5% for non-first-time homebuyers, has no PMI, and offers a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage on home loans up to 806,500 in most areas. The Pharmacist home loan is available in all states except Alaska and Hawaii and can be used to purchase condos as well. However, rates may be higher and a condo review has to be completed. And finally, an important reminder that the content in this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on for investment or any other advice. Information in the podcast and corresponding materials should not be construed as a solicitation or offer to buy or sell any investment or related financial products. For more information on this, you can visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/disclaimer. Thanks so much for listening. Have a great rest of your week.